So to set this in context, I wake up each day, and I'll be totally honest, I usually don't feel like bouncing right out of bed. I wake up generally more tired and groggy than I would like because I tend to go to sleep too late. What it means is that I'm not really matching my hardwired needs of going to bed probably at 8:30 or 9 and waking up at 4 a.m. So neuroplasticity will allow me to optimize my wakefulness, but I have to do something in order to access that. And some of you may already be anticipating what I'm about to say, which is, oh no, he's going to tell us to get sunlight in our eyes in the first 30 minutes of the day. I am going to tell you to do that, but I'm going to also tell you two things that I have not discussed before, which relate to the plasticity between the melanopsin cells, these sunlight detecting, bright light detecting cells in our eye, and the circadian clock. I've never said this before in this podcast, but it turns out that the connections between these melanopsin cells and the circadian clock are plastic throughout the lifespan. So there's an opportunity for short-term plasticity. So that's why I view sunlight first thing in the day. It helps me wake up. The other thing that I do is that there's a circuit that exists between the circadian clock and our adrenals that I've talked about before that triggers the release of cortisol first thing in the morning that wakes us up, especially when we view light. So if you're groggy in the morning, that's why viewing light is helpful. The other thing that I do is I delay my intake of caffeine for the first 2 hours that I'm awake. Earlier, we talked about the adenosine system and how the accumulation of adenosine makes us sleepy. And caffeine suppresses adenosine. It makes us feel alert. And so by delaying caffeine until about 2 hours after waking, I'm able to capture and reinforce, to potentiate the neural circuit that exists between the circadian clock and the cortisol release in the adrenals, as well as leave those adenosine receptors unoccupied so that I can then use the caffeine to get a natural lift in alertness and focus 2 hours later, as opposed to using it just to wake myself up out of sleepiness. I also make sure I hydrate first thing in the morning. There's plenty of data now showing that even a slight increase in dehydration, meaning just when you're lacking water, can make people have headaches. It can provide some additional photophobia. For those of you that are migraine prone, bright light can trigger migraines. That's no surprise to those of you that get headaches and migraines. But dehydration can compound the vulnerability to migraine and headache. So I drink water, I drink black coffee, or I drink mate, which is just because I have Argentine lineage, which is just a high caffeine drink first thing in the morning. But I delay it until 2 hours after I wake up. And that's because I want the circuits between my eye and my circadian clock and my adrenals to be functioning in a particular way so that then later the caffeine is an addition, it adds more alertness. Now, many of you might ask about exercise and when to exercise. In terms of rising body temperatures, and matching body temperature to mental alertness, et cetera, it's pretty clear that exercising early in the day not only biases us towards waking up earlier, but that it also triggers the release of things like epinephrine and other neuromodulators that lend itself to a situation where we have heightened levels of arousal and mental acuity in the late morning and even into the afternoon. Now, this can be very good because if you want to restrict most of your focused learning to the early part of the day, exercising early in the day does set a neurochemical context or milieu for go. It tends to trigger activation of the go pathway. And so for those of you like myself who have a hard time kind of engaging and getting into action early in the day, early morning exercise within an hour of waking, and certainly no later than 3 hours after waking, will give you, quote unquote, more energy throughout the day. So in kind of reviewing what I've said up until now, I do the morning light thing. I delay my caffeine 2 hours after waking, and then I generally try and get exercise in the first hour, or ideally within the first 3 hours of waking up, and then I'll move into a focused learning bout. If I find that I'm too alert, and then I generally will tend to eat and kind of bring down my level of alertness and will continue working. I typically eat my first meal right around midday, whether or not I've exercised or not. In general, I rely on a low carbohydrate meal. I'll eat meat or salad or some variation of that, and nuts and fats and things like that because of the choline content for focus. I'm just going to continue to march through my day. And this is, of course, what I experience. Some people are quite different. But what I find is around 2 or 3 p.m., I start getting a little groggy, a little bit sleepy. I will tend to shift my work from work that requires a lot of duration path outcome, really careful analysis and activation of the no-go pathway. Around early afternoon, I find I can do kind of typical, more mundane tasks because those tasks require less cognitive load and they can be done more or less in and out of sequence. I can answer a couple email here, maybe answer that email there. And then typically around 4 p.m. or so, I do two things. One is I make sure I hydrate, and then I always do a non-sleep deep rest protocol sometime in the afternoon. This is sometimes a 10-minute Yoga Nidra type protocol or a 30-minute Yoga Nidra type protocol. And I do that because for me, by about 4:30 in the afternoon, I'm capable of doing basically nothing. I personally find it a mistake to, at that point, down a double espresso and charge really hard. It just doesn't work for me. I end up really disrupting my sleep schedule. I end up disrupting a lot of different things. So for me, I do the non-sleep deep rest protocol. I usually emerge from that feeling like I have another whole day second win, like I could just work. And then I'll do a second bout of learning. I'll do some sort of work that either involves linear analysis of something, so maybe numerical work, or I'm trying to learn something. This learning bout is very different than the morning one. This is a work bout or learning bout that's more in the clear, calm, and focus regime because I've come out of this non-sleep deep rest. I'm not ingesting caffeine because I want to make sure that I can sleep later that night really well. And this tends to be more when I do creative type work. Now, that gets us more to the kind of late afternoon, evening. Now, I am, as I've mentioned before, I'm a proponent of getting sunlight in the evening as well. By getting light in the evening, it accomplishes two things for me. First of all, it makes sure that I don't get up too early, that I'm not waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning because it's going to shift my clock. It's going to delay it a little bit. And so this is really important. If you want to keep your schedule on a normal routine, on a regular 24-hour cycle and not have your circadian rhythms of sleep and wakefulness drifting all over the place, and you want some predictability to how your mind is going to work in order to optimize learning and performance, well, then you need to get morning light and evening light. The morning light is going to advance my clock, make my system want to get up earlier, and the evening light is going to delay my clock a little bit so that on average it kind of bookends my circadian mechanisms, and I'll basically want to go to sleep at more or less the same time each night and wake up more or less at the same time each morning. That's how it works. And that's a hardwired mechanism. That's not some subjective thing that I tell myself. That's a hardwired mechanism. So that gets us to the evening. And generally in the evening, I'll get that light by going outside, and then I'll start to dim them for the evening because, as I've mentioned many times before, and I'm not going to belabor the point, you want to minimize your light exposure, especially overhead bright light exposure, in the evening from about 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. So for me, it's screens off, it's dim lights, and that's what favors falling asleep in a good night's sleep for me. Since we were talking about food earlier, I'll just revisit a little bit of what I said before. My evening meal tends to be more carbohydrate rich. So I'm not one of these people that's keto or high meat only or anything like that. Remember, fasting and low carbohydrate states facilitate alertness. Carbohydrate rich foods facilitate calmness and sleepiness. They stimulate the release of tryptophan and the transition to sleep. I tend to achieve that state using carbohydrates, and it also replenishes glycogen. In reviewing my schedule for you, just as a context for how to implement certain types of tools for optimizing learning, realize that it gives the impression that there's a 90-minute bout of learning and work in the morning and then a 90-minute bout of creative type work in the afternoon, and that's it. There are a lot of hours in between, of course, and I just want to be very clear. Those hours for me are occupied by pretty, not mundane tasks, but things that are kind of random. Those are things like email or attending to Zoom meetings or meeting with colleagues and students and things of that sort. I mentioned those two 90-minute bouts because those are the two 90-minute bouts where I'm trying to expand on the mental capacities that I already have. They're really where I'm trying to stretch and grow what I'm able to do on a regular basis reflexively. And so for many of you out there who are in school or who have family demands or other demands, the key is to slot in those brain optimization segments of about 90 minutes, 1 or 2 or maybe more per day. You're trying to slot those in wherever you can amidst your other obligations and things that you need to do. But you want to do that in an intelligent way that's anchored to your biology. And then you want to do a number of things, which I've talked about today, in order to optimize those sessions to get the most out of them.